Welcome to season 2 of Talk Lab to Me. Talk Lab to Me is an engaging discourse podcast hosted by COLA, a leading physician-directed accrediting organization that provides education and accreditation services to laboratories of all sizes. The podcast covers a wide range of topics, including the latest developments in laboratory science and medicine, as well as in-depth interviews with regulators and industry thought leaders about the importance of regulatory compliance. Welcome to Talk Lab to Me. I am happy to be back with you all. My guest today is Stephanie Whitehead, who is an accomplished executive laboratory leader recognized for her warm and approachable demeanor with extensive experience in both hospital administration and laboratory operations. She combines her expertise in conflict resolution, team building, and customer-focused service. Join me in welcoming Stephanie to Talk Lab to Me. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hello. Thank you for having me today. I'm so excited for our conversation.
Well, as everyone who has tuned in before knows, I jump right in. So, Talk Lab to Me. So, what I want to know, just starting out, looking at your impressive, very impressive resume, is if you could think back, what was that defining moment that made you realize leadership was something you wanted to actively pursue?
Well, again, Danny, I love your question. Thank you for having me again today. You know, not only do I love the question, I love the way you asked it because so many people don't realize that leadership is a skill. Some people will say that age-old adage that, I'm a born leader. And I do think people are born with innate personalities and tendencies towards, stepping up and taking an active approach or initiating things. But I think leadership in itself is a definite skill. And so going back to your question, I don't know that there was one day where I woke up and I said, I want to be a leader. I want to run a lab. But I definitely can think back on times in my career when I realized that I cared deeply about how other people felt at work. I can remember being very early on in my generalist MLS career, working that night shift, and I worked at UMC Medical Center in Jackson, Mississippi, when I first got out of school with some very brilliant scientists. I mean, some of the best scientists that I have ever worked with in my career. And I just saw so many people get burnt out, not because of the science and not because they didn't have the technical skill, but because they were tired of not feeling heard or supported or being developed. And that was actually my own story. And that's actually how I got into leadership. And so I just remember thinking, there's got to be a better way to do this, and I think that probably is the moment that you're asking about. Um, I didn't want to just get good lab work done and help patients, but I wanted our scientists and our labs to be environments where people could thrive doing that.
I want to give a shout out to all our night shifters. That's what Stephanie and I have in common, amongst many other things. We were both generalist night shift. And it is so true that people do get burnt out. And in our current industry, where we are struggling with retention and recruitment, that we want people to come into a pleasant environment.
Mhm.
And when I, just think about those night shifts and all the amazing people that I interacted with, I started my career at Mercy Medical Center
Mhm.
many moons ago, and they were fabulous laboratory science professionals, full of so much knowledge, but they were tired. They,
Mhm.
feeling that they weren't making the difference in the areas they thought they should be. So another part of leadership is dealing with what comes up on a day to day. I remember saying, okay, what's today's fire, right?
Mhm.
When you feel like there's all these different fires and all these different things going on, what's your approach to crisis situations?
My approach to crisis situation is realizing that that is my role. I'm the person that you hired to control the crisis. And I think that's so simple to say, but so many leaders feel defeated and feel down and feel like a failure when there are problems in their laboratory. And when I coach and mentor people, I always remind them if I didn't have a problem, if my organization never had an issue, why do I need a CEO? Why do I need a laboratory director if I never had a billing problem, if I never had a staffing issue? You are there to solve the problem. And the higher you go up that ladder, the more you get paid, the bigger your office is, the bigger those problems you have to solve are. And so when a problem comes your way, look at it as job security. Like this is this is why I'm here. All right, guys, this is not a drill. This is where I come in and shine. So that's the first step is realizing that when problems happen, they are natural. That is part of working in an organization and part of being a leader. And that's really your role is to be there to solve them. Me personally, I always thought it was so odd every time people would compliment me, and I'm going to say it's a compliment, but people would say, "You're so calm, you're so even, you just seem so even killed." And I work really hard at that. I've done a lot of work internally in terms of self-awareness and what are my triggers and just understanding how to control my reactions. So my method, I would say, is to first regulate yourself. I think The Next Conversation by Jefferson Fisher should be required reading for any laboratory leader. And it takes a lot for me to promote a book, especially if it's not something that, I get anything out of. But I think it's just so essential. In the book, he talks about just understanding yourself and understanding your triggers because you can't resolve conflict from a nervous system, a state that is in fight or flight, right? So calm is contagious. When I'm in an escalated situation, typically I tend to lower my voice and I'll slow my cadence down. I may even shorten my sentences. And so it's very difficult for the other person in the situation not to follow that same cadence. And it just brings down the elevation of the room. Um, Especially when there's, patient care issues. I love to try to get down to what is the true problem, what is actually affecting us right now. If there is a true issue in the laboratory, a safety issue, or a patient care issue, I try to stabilize that risk. And then when everything feels urgent, that's when leadership really truly matters. And so that's when you really have to step up and really remain calm and try to do everything you can to kind of eliminate all the emotional noise and lean into operational confidence.
What do you see as the most common source of conflict in the clinical laboratory setting?
In my experience, it is generally communication gaps. I very rarely see, and it happens, right? There's a plethora of reasons. I'm not going to say that's the only reason, but very commonly I see either unclear expectations or communication gaps being the highest two source of conflict. And usually it's some type of role ambiguity. I thought that was your job. You thought it was my job. Nobody did it. We're making assumptions. Stress can amplify things very easily in the laboratory because you've worked in the lab. You just mentioned it. The phones are ringing, the tube system's going off. Maybe it's a peak hour, it's morning run at the night shift. So there's turnaround time demands and there's priorities and there's, QC to do and machines to calibrate and stats to repeat or critical values to repeat. And, all of these things are going at the same time. And you have 10, 15 people all working supposedly in tandem, but one miscommunication can lead, down a myriad of issues. And so when I hear things like that's not my job, or nobody told me that, or day shift always, or night shift always, or you know, second shift never, you know, those are always alerts to me. I try to notice words in people's sentences that are infinite, always, never, they. because that's assumption language and that's not fact language. And, just try to walk people back off of that cliff. So I train myself and my leaders to try to move conversations from assumption to articulation of the facts, and let's separate intent from impact, which is huge a lot of the times because laboratory people, we are mission driven, we are process driven. Nobody is coming to work, I hope, to to create harm or confusion. And so we want to honor that, right? We want to, let people know, I know that wasn't your intention to delay testing, Danny, but the impact of what you did had that result. And so can you tell me a little bit more about what led to this and really um, honoring people as professionals and assuming that they meant to do well. But I do always let people know you're responsible for both your intent and your impact. So although that may not have been your intention, to yell at our phlebotomist. That was your impact. And we're responsible for both. And we, work really hard to attack the problem and not the person, because people are adults and people are professionals, and attacking people know when they're not doing the best. And so it doesn't do me any good to attack you as a person. What does do good is, for me to establish a shared agreement and align on a shared purpose and goal and make sure you have clear expectations of what success looks like and then hold you accountable to that.
And when we talk about conflict resolution, I think some of the tips you gave were so meaningful, and we're saying it in leadership, but I think it's important for everyone to take away, regardless if your title is that of leadership. These are tools that everyone can use. I mean, we're talking about the laboratory industry, but I do believe these tools they go far greater than just the laboratory industry. But when you're working with others, and you're on the bench and you're having those stressful moments, and maybe that person gave you that sample in the wrong manner for the fourth time today,
Mhm.
that you take that moment instead of blowing up at that person and just use those tips you just gave us to calm the situation down. Because if you approach it with that blow up, you're not going to get the outcome that you're seeking,
Mhm.
rather than what you just told us, which I think it's great for all of us listening to take that back in those stressful moments and when you just want to shake something to
Mhm.
utilize those things. So, as we were talking about conflict resolution, which I think is just a part of every workplace and tips on how to deal with that, it goes to the conversation about your team
Mhm.
and building that cohesive team. It's great if you have a team that never ever has a conflict. That's wonderful. I don't know how many of those exist, but that is a wonderful thought. So, I would like to know from you, how do you go about building that genuinely cohesive team environment when you're working in this very high pressure, detail oriented setting?
Mhm. Well, I think it goes back to what we kind of talked about earlier, which is understanding that problems and issues are normal. It is a normal part of operations. It's a normal part of having a large organization that is working collectively in terms of patient care. Healthcare is difficult. Healthcare is very nuanced, and so is the laboratory. And so you'll never find a laboratory team that doesn't have a process to work through. If you find the perfect lab, leave because because any lab who has set their mind that we are doing everything completely perfect and doesn't plan on improving or even investigating how can we do this better for our patients is not the lab you want to work in. And so any lab that is working through conflict is doing a very normal thing. And I think the first part is to normalize, we will have professional conflict. And the only reason it makes people uncomfortable is because I don't think it's been normalized and I don't think people understand how to do it well. We can have a disagreement professionally, and if done well, you walk away feeling heard and respected, and I walk away feeling heard and respected, even if we didn't necessarily come to a resolution. And so I think that cohesion doesn't happen during pizza pizza days or team building lunches or during lab week. It has to happen consistently and with consistent leadership behaviors that are observed every single day that reinforce psychological safety, that show that your leader is present, and that your leader has, again, those clear behavior standards that they're holding everybody accountable to, and that you can trust them. And those are things, like I said, that you instill with a person on day one. That's why I'm excited to be a part of the upcoming COLA Enrichment Forum, because we'll be talking about, how your leadership impact starts on day one. And actually, before day one, when you're interviewing a person and when they come on board and they have spent all night ironing their clothes and, wayfinding their way to your parking lot and understanding how long it's going to take them to get to your lab on that very first day. And they walk in super excited, super prepared with their notebook, with their lunchbox and their water bottle, and they're here to, it's a big deal to change jobs in your adult career. And they are here to make an impact, and they walk into the lab and you forgot they were coming that day. Or you say, okay, yeah, go in the conference room and read some procedures, and you put them in a room full of binders for that first day and never go check on them. And then the conference room has glass, and so all of the other staff are walking by looking in the conference room like they're a zoo animal, staring. Is that the new person? Is that the new person on the second shift? You know, we have to have higher standards for ourselves in understanding what excellence looks like, and then show that so people can feel seen in those situations. And again, that starts on day one.
You mentioned psychological safety, and I will say early in my career, I did not have a name for it. I did not know the name for it. I knew there were different things that were happening. So it took me learning and understanding and growing in my career to understand how important that is in the workplace. And with leadership is understanding it and how to create it. If you had to give a leader one tip coming into a new environment of how to create that psychologically safe environment in order to have a cohesive team, what would be your tip to them as to where to start?
I would say be present and be seen with your team. Um, I'm not going to say the problem, the opportunity we have so much in leadership, especially in healthcare, is we are treating our operations like it's a finite game. So there are finite games, there are infinite games, and there are finite games. So for your listeners, a finite game might be tic-tac-toe, right? There's rules, there's a target. I'm trying to get three in a row. We're going to draw that line, and I won, and then we move on. We might play again. If we were to play Connect Four, or if we were to play Jenga, that's a finite game. There is a winner and a loser, and the rules are set, and we hit the target, and then we move on. Um, Healthcare is an infinite game. Nobody wins at healthcare. Education is an infinite game. Nobody finishes education. You should ideally be continuously learning, continuously growing, and the same thing with your team and your leadership. It should be continuously evolving. And you should always be looking for ways to improve on your culture. Every time you add a new person to your team, the culture shifts. And so your organization grows, people evolve, people should be growing. And a healthy organization brings people on, they evolve, and they do that over and over and over again, even under pressure and situations. And so I would say in order to build psychological safety, it's about leaning into those moments that are difficult for you, and being steadfast in those times. A lot of being a present leader is understanding yourself and being aware of what your own triggers are. Again, you cannot manage from an emotionally unregulated place. And if your nervous system is in fight or flight, if every time you have to have a difficult conversation, you cannot actively listen, and you cannot, think clearly because you're feeling triggered yourself, then you're not going to be able to instill that power into your team or reflect that into your team. And so much of that comes from you understanding yourself, what triggers you, You controlling your responses, um, and you understanding when you can have conversations and when you can't. It's okay not to have every conversation you're invited to. Somebody walks through your door and says, "Hey, Danny, can I have 5 minutes?" And you're in the middle of an important meeting, or you're just not in a time and space and mind frame where you can talk. It's okay to say, "Yeah, give me 5 minutes." Or even if you get caught in the hallway and somebody starts complaining, it's okay to say, "That's a really great perspective. Can you give me some time to digest that? I'd love to think about that a little bit and come back to you." So many times we get ourselves pulled into conversations that we aren't prepared for, and that leads to a bigger breakdown. So take some time to think and pause and come back with a solution uh, that builds and doesn't take away.
Thank you for that information. I think a lot of times as leaders, we have almost a knee-jerk reaction.
Mhm.
We feel the need, oh, I have to give you this answer, that I have to have the answer to everything at all times. And
Mhm.
that's not the expectation. It is really important to take that time and let me sit with it. Let me make sure that when I do come back, I have an answer of value versus a knee jerk that might be missing
Mhm.
some critical components that can help that person. And you're
Mhm.
still attending to them, you're still giving them the attention needed and being present, as you mentioned, as a leader, but able to
Mhm.
fulfill their requests or whatever that need is in a more meaningful manner. As we've been talking about conflict resolution and building a team, what do you think is something that many people get wrong about managing people? I would say it's the fact of people do not understand the importance and the weight of communication. Would be
Yeah, yeah,
my.
yeah.
You mentioned that earlier, but that's where my mind goes. What would you say?
I agree with that. Like we went to and we talked about, one of the most common sources of miscommunication or conflict in the lab are those communication gaps or just ineffective communication. I would say what most leaders get wrong and very likely unintentionally is that we cannot overmanage task and undermanage energy. And like I said, it's not intentional because as laboratory scientists, there's a lot of task, right? There's checklists and there's temperatures and there's QC and all of these procedures and there's all these checklists. And we think if we just tighten up the policy, if we, I updated the policy, people, you know, and if I just track it in a metric, the turnaround time is this. And if I add a checklist, if I update the checklist and send out a job aid, then now everybody's going to be perfect. Or if I build a dashboard that everybody can see, now everybody's going to be perfect. And employee engagement will just follow when I fix my procedure, you know. And you can't spreadsheet your way to employee engagement. That's just, you know, not human psychology because people aren't workflows. People are people. People are living systems. Um, and healthcare is a living system. People come to work with an emotional load. People come with their own grief and their own urgencies and their own moral stresses and their own fatigue and their own mental priorities. And your organization has priorities to do more with less, and all of those things are competing. So when we start treating people like they're not humans, and like their human capacity or their cognitive capacity is unlimited, and we treat them like a number and not a story, I think that's where we fail. Metrics are extremely helpful. I'm a scientist. I know that quality control is extremely helpful, but metrics are not the whole mission. The environment is. And I think when we don't lean into trust and belonging and clarity and recovery, when we do something wrong, you're not going to get it right every single time. Like I said, it's an infinite game. And so psychological safety is not something you win or you've mastered, or now I got my certificate and so I can do it well, got my black belt. And so when I need to go back and do service recovery with one of my employees, if I'm not doing those things, and recognizing when those things happen, then that's a failure. Um, so much of what we do as leaders require so much emotional intelligence, uh, and in many areas, I hate the term soft skills because it's not soft skills. It's basic human skills, I think, it's great to know, are we hitting our numbers? Are we meeting our metrics? But also know, what is it costing our people to meet those metrics? And is that cost sustainable? Again, people are cognitive load, they're not infinite. And so if we're managing people like they're the machines, I think that's where we fail, because the machines are the machines and the people are the people, right?
Being
Hmm.
a human leader, being empathetic, and having that carry on to how you view others and how you distribute tasks. Yeah, we can meet it, but if your turnover, because people are getting burnt out, what does that cost? Most of
Hmm.
these things can be correlated to that financial bottom line.
Hmm.
And as we're talking about this, how do you shift that mindset for a lot of people where they stop seeing our clinicians, our physicians, and our patients as I got to do this next versus this patient is someone's loved one. This patient
Right.
is another human depending on you. How do you help people still see that when all the fires, coming back to the
Yeah.
fires, all the fires are going on?
Well, you have to remain human for yourself, right? And you have to remember why we're doing this. And it's so easy, especially in the laboratory, being the behind the scene heroes that we are. And we love that mantra, being the behind the scenes hero. But sometimes you have to help people get from behind the scenes and understand their impact into this entire wheel called healthcare, and where they fall in that. And so I love to tell stories, especially for our new employees. I usually tell people that I'm explaining laboratory services to outside of our profession, that lab for me, and I come from being a blood banker, lab for me, it's very adjacent to being a 911 operator, right? So we are there in the thick of an emergency, like in the blood bank. I'm helping you get this blood. I'm taking this phone call, run, 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 run. And then after you get that blood, then what? I don't know what happens to that patient. I don't know if they made it or not. I just know I got to move on to the next patient. Um, and I'm working on this stat as quickly as I can for this NICU baby. And then what? I've been seeing this baby's name for as many days as a baby stays in the NICU, sometimes months, almost a year sometimes. And then I don't see the name anymore. And I don't know, did they get discharged? Hope so. Or did something else happen? I hope not. And so those things can weigh on our staff. And that's almost like that second victim syndrome, right? And so that's when you lean into that trauma-informed care and you connect the work that do back to the patient for them through stories. So I connect turnaround times to real patients waiting on diagnosis. And you helping to expedite that, or you making sure that we got a quality sample from that bone marrow, help this patient, get immediate treatment. That was the first step that they needed. A quality sample sets the ceiling for a patient being able to move on to their next game or the next stage in their healing journey. Um, I connect specimen integrity to a real mom in the ER, or any way that you can really humanize the work from being just the next tube coming out of the tube system to something that's really impactful. Um, you know, our organization does a lot of wonderful things. We have a transplant service line, and so when a patient does get a successful transplant, a lot of times they'll bring in the entire team that helped with that transplant, and I make sure that my team is involved so they can see their piece in making sure, and the family's there. And sometimes that patient has children. And many times I let people know, you're not on the organ transplant list because you have a lot of other options in life. And so just like I said, how you can humanize the work so people understand, because it can get very robotic. It can get very, this troponin, I'm just trying to spin it down and get it done. It's and when you get to that point, it gets very easy to become lackadaisical, to cancel a sample rather than to look for another solution to get it, run in a different way. Because that's not my mom, that's not my kid, that's not my husband in the ER waiting on that. You're just gonna have to recollect it because it's not the label's not perfectly straight. Um, And so those are the things that we try to do, even down to all levels of our organization, even with the phlebotomist, understanding you are the front-facing part of our organization. People will likely never see, the person in the blood bank, the, person streaking their sample in microbiology, but they will see you as a phlebotomist, and you represent the lab to them when they say, I need to get labs. They only know the phlebotomist, they don't generally know the front receiving clerk, or the billing person, or even the lab manager. And so we really help them understand their role and their importance to our mission.
Storytelling has been a very powerful tool going back to the history of mankind. It
Hmm.
is how we relay emotions, it's how we keep our history and narrative alive. And storytelling to bring forth that closed circle with what happens to the patient is so valuable. A lot
Hmm.
of clinical laboratory educators I know use storytelling for our students to tell them, oh, what to expect or to bring home what they may be working into. I think that's a great idea to carry that on into the professional setting because, like you said, a lot of times once you see that last result, you may not know what happens, especially if you're not in a facility where you're able to see maybe a smaller facility, an urgent care, or something where you're able to just say what happened and see that. And that's what, in my opinion, keeps you loving the lab as well.
Hmm.
When you see that impact, and unfortunately, sometimes the outcome isn't what we want, but that also reminds you when you treat that next sample
Hmm.
who's on the line. It's always someone's loved one. It's always a human at the end of that. And it's important for us to keep that in mind when it might be number 4268 or,
Right.
something that's just a number. And
Hmm.
I think that is crucial for everyone listening to take that jewel of knowledge that you just gave us, Stephanie,
Hmm.
and just sit with that opportunity to story tell a situation, whether it's to your coworker, whether it's to your nursing staff, your radiology staff, to just bring them into the laboratory world. Stories stay with people
Hmm.
way longer than you need to do this.
Yeah.
That story drives it home and it draws a thread within the fabric of which we work in patient care.
Yeah.
Tell us about Elaborate. How did that podcast come to life? And did you see a gap in the industry you were trying to fill? Tell me a little bit about your podcast.
So I actually co-host two podcasts, but we'll talk about Elaborate Topics first. And Elaborate Topics was actually born out of frustration for me, really, and a little bit of lack of vision. So I'll go there with you. And it was the mid of the pandemic. So this is 2020. And I work in a laboratory that was fortunate enough to have a lot of both tribal and scientific knowledge in our laboratory. And so some of the individuals who worked in our laboratory during the time of COVID had actually worked in the laboratory when HIV was a pandemic. So they were like, this is just one more emerging disease. Like they just knew supply this and, metric that. And we start tracking positive and negatives here. And so much of that tribal knowledge in past experience in other emerging diseases helped us kind of have a foot ahead as we were tackling the COVID pandemic. And so, as the months continue to go on, our lab, while other laboratories may not have been performing well or doing well, we were actually having a lot of success. I mean, we were able to keep people busy, keep people safe, stand up systems to communicate because normal modes of communication, like being close to each other or having hallway conversations, had stopped. And so I wanted a platform to get information about what we were doing out to other lab leaders because I could see the news and I could read blogs and posts and storyboards from my colleagues who were struggling in many areas of like supply and communication and engagement and things like that. And I wanted to say like, hey, we're doing well over here. How can I let you all know the information and the things that we're doing? And so I connected with a friend and she said, why don't you reach out to one of my colleagues, Tawana Wilson? She has a podcast, and maybe you can get on her podcast, and she can feature you. And I was keeping a notebook of all the things that we were doing, and she said maybe she'll let you share that with people on her platform. And so I reached out to her, and we started talking, and she said, you know what? I actually think we have enough to do our own podcast. And I was just like, what? That wasn't even a possibility to me. I didn't even know anything about recording a podcast. If you go back and listen to season one, I'm sorry. I was so nervous that entire year. I didn't know what I was doing. But we were just, myself, Tawana Wilson, Lona Small, we were just brilliant minds in laboratory medicine who over time saw that there was a gap in leadership with practical skill, um, information for emerging leaders and more tenured leaders. There was a lack of just support, of visibility, and we wanted to create a space that just wasn't technical lectures and something for CE credit. We wanted to create a space where we could um, elevate the profession and expand how people see each other and ourselves. And so we ran that podcast for 5 years. And the funny thing is that, again, the podcast started during the pandemic. And so we actually didn't meet in person for almost 4 years. It's just a funny story that I tell people. Me and Taiwana ended up meeting in person at a conference about 3 years after the podcast had been going weekly. We were doing a weekly podcast for almost 3 years before we met in person. And I think we all finally took a picture together in, I believe, 2023 at a different conference. And so we ran that podcast until right up at 2025. And then, as many things happen, life just takes over. And we decided to continue to move on to our different collective ways. And so now I co-host a podcast called Superstat with my dear colleagues, Dr. Melody Bourgeois Nelson and Erin Odegaard. And it is more scientifically focused, but it's short. It's super stat. It's 20 minutes or less. And we talk about headlines and things that are emerging in our profession and what, laboratory professionals need to know scientifically.
Yes, thank you. And they will all be at the Cola Laboratory Enrichment Forum. So if you haven't registered, you need to register. These are some brilliant minds, and you want to be in the same space with them. And I am so excited that there are these clinical laboratory podcasts that are happening right now. When I get to talk to students, I'm like, you have to listen to these podcasts. It is any opportunity to learn more about the industry, different perspectives and stuff is always better for our field. And I look forward to what is to come in the future. So please tune in, everyone. My next question to you is I always like to ask this future question of our guests. Where do you see laboratory science heading in the next 5 to 10 years? What are you excited about and what are you concerned about?
Um, you know, Healthcare in itself is evolving so quickly, and public health is going through so many different transitions that it's hard to say where we'll be, but I do know that moving forward, I'm sure we will see greater automation, um, expansion of potentially point of care testing. I'm really excited about the number of people who are leaning into the value-based care alignment space and just really looking at data-driven diagnostics and how laboratory is a focal point in many of the drivers in healthcare. So I'm excited but cautious. I mean, I think technology, AI, automation, all those things can help accelerate the work that we do. Technology for sure strengthens diagnostic medicine, but it doesn't replace operational rigor that goes behind it, right? So what good does it do me to have great digital pathology scanners if I don't have the staff or the processes to do the scanning, right? So that's what I always try to impress upon our C-suite is that we love technology. We're not a proponent against it. We think it strengthens diagnostic, but it doesn't replace the people doing it, or the workforce pipeline that it takes to keep up with it.
As we look to the future, what are some skills that you think the future leaders need to have in order to succeed?
Definitely data literacy. So many times before, I think, you could get away with having publishing turnaround times and having a dashboard and not really deciphering the dashboard. But I think moving forward, especially to clearly articulate the value of laboratory to healthcare, so you don't get bought and you don't get sold, and so that the world doesn't eventually turn out to be just two laboratories, and I won't name them, but you know who they are. I think lab leaders need to learn the true value of data literacy, and that means understanding lagging and leading indicators. That means understanding, interpreting your operational data in context that makes sense to people outside the laboratory. We're great at talking to each other. We need to get more skilled in talking to people outside of ourselves. So just understanding what does that turnaround time trend actually mean to the clinician, is that is that productivity dip staffing related or volume related? And what is the downstream effect of what you do on things that matter to your C-suite, like length of stay and things like that. um, I think change management, particularly as healthcare in our nation continues to change. You need to be a master at being able to articulate the different constant motions that are happening. So that could be mergers, that can be outreach expansions, that could be AI integration. Um, just understanding how to adapt and be nimble in change management. And sometimes that's hard. So human adoption of change can sometimes be hard. But being able to lean into change and communicate change to your team is going to be important. We see it even here that, people get change fatigue, and that is real in the laboratory because there are so many innate and moving parts to changing anything in the laboratory. And so managing that part well will be, I believe, a core competency and not just an optional skill. It'll be something you have to do. And I think finally, moving forward, if you don't have a workforce strategy that you are designing now that will sustain you over the next 10 years, and you will be at a true deficit. I think 10 years ago, we scheduled around our vacancies, but I think in the next 3 to 5 years, what you will start to see is if you don't have a strategy for where are my gaps in my skill mix, where does automation not replace repetition, what advanced competencies do I need or should I have had? Staffing is no longer going to cover that, and there's a lot of competitive positioning that will be happening. So designing flex staffing models and cross training intentionally and building that pipeline with partners through your schools. I think people um, in years previous were probably lackadaisical about clinical rotation partnerships. Um, but they will have to be more intentional about those partnerships. Partnerships with organizations like COLA that can help strengthen leaders and strengthen your best practices so you can be as efficient as possible will be extremely important.
Mentioned data literacy. I think that's an important tool in your leadership toolbox, especially as we come out of the lab. When we talk about laboratory data and patient outcomes, and we're going to have that's for the COLA Laboratory Enrichment Forum. Our keynotes will be talking about that. It's so important to solidify our seat at the table with
Mhm.
these things. I remember sitting in a keynote by Dr. Adams, and he said, if you're not having a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And I think that's really important to remember as we move forward and healthcare continues to evolve, that we are flexible. And one thing I know as a like more of a day-to-day operations, having that flexible scheduling or that cross training, a lot of people overlook that and say, well, this is my team. But if we are able to cross train and elevate the skills of our staff, not only does it play into the engagement, because they're like, oh, I'm getting to learn something else, I'm solidifying, but it also enriches the culture, expands your workforce. So, as you think back on your wonderful journey and to have a continued wonderful journey, that what is like the best piece of advice that someone gave you early in your career that you still hold on till today?
Um, the best and most powerful piece of advice that still stays with me, and it sounds harsh, but I'm gonna just say it because it's helped me so much, is no one is coming. And again, it sounds harsh, but it's when you lean into it, it's incredibly empowering because it means that nobody is coming to hand you confidence and nobody is coming to make you ready and nobody is coming to validate you or make you feel like you're enough. You have to decide that you are enough and you have to decide that you are ready and the actions that you take that precede confidence help you to move and confidence catches up. And so early on, I would think maybe I need one more certification, or maybe I need another year of experience, or maybe I need somebody to tap me on the shoulder and like affirm that I'm okay and that I'm ready. But when you really think about the fact that nobody is coming, when we're talking about this entire conversation about leadership, leadership isn't assigned, it's assumed. And so anybody can step up and take care of people because that's all leadership is. It's raising your hand and saying, the people around me, I'm going to take care of you guys. So, in moments where I was sitting in a room and I was a little bit timid, but I still rose my hand and spoke up. The moments where I went to a conference, last year's COLA Enrichment Forum was my first time doing a workshop. And I told Danny I can do it, because confidence comes again from taking that first action and trying, and then confidence follows. So take ownership to do something that is technically not your job. Move, speak, decide, adjust. You may not get it right, but just have the courage to act. Um, and that advice has reshaped how I look at opportunities that have come my way. Because instead of saying, am I ready? Which the answer would most likely always be no. I ask myself, am I willing to try? Am I willing to give this a try? And even if I fail, I'd rather look back and say, I'm proud of myself for trying rather than, dang, I wish I would at least saw what could happen.
I love that. No one is coming. I love that. I have a board, a dry erase board, and it has posters on it on different sayings. And I am going to put that up there on my board. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and the
Yeah,
next time you need somebody to reaffirm you, remember nobody is coming.
nobody is coming. I like that. So, as we conclude this podcast, what do you want laboratory science professionals who are listening today to walk away feeling or thinking about a little differently?
That's a big question, and I'm going to try to give you not a huge answer because I we can't boil the ocean for sure. But one of the biggest problems I see in our profession, and I've made it my mission to really talk to leaders about this, is we need to, as a profession and as a profession of leaders, stop treating leadership like it's a reward for technical excellence. So what I mean by that is so many times we are promoting the strongest scientist or the best bench tech or the most detailed problem solver or the person who knows how to fix all the machines or answer all the doctor's questions and just hoping they can lead. But it's leadership is not a byproduct of your technical mastery or your scientific expertise. Those are two different skills. Your technical skills get you promoted, but your scientific skills help you keep a team. And I really wish somebody had told me that early on in my career. It would have saved me so many different problems because I was a great scientist. I was not a great leader. I had to really work. at understanding that. And so leadership development needs to come before you get the title. So if anybody is listening to me, um, start working on those skills early on. We can teach you QC in school, we can teach you how to validate something in school, but we cannot teach you how to give effective feedback or how to manage burnout or how to have difficult conversations or how to manage difficult personalities. And so laboratory medicine is complex, but leadership is also complex. And I think as we move forward, you had a lot of great questions about the future. And when we look forward to sustaining high impact teams, operational teams that can withstand and be resilient against all of the things that are happening in healthcare and have great retention, it will rely on us not being accidental about our leadership development and being intentional because science moves fast. And so we need to develop people just as quickly.
Thank you. I want to thank you for your time. Every opportunity that I have to sit and speak to you, whether at the forum or in this space, you always leave me with such pearls of knowledge, and I appreciate it. And I would say to everyone out here listening, please come out and see Cascade. We have a wonderful lineup followed by our laboratory enrichment forum. You can have an opportunity to meet people such as Stephanie. I had the opportunity to meet her through having this laboratory enrichment forum, and I'm so honored that you taken this time to join us here on Talk Lab to Me. So, as always, until next time, stay compliant, stay curious, and keep talking lab to me.